The Viking Age, spanning from the late 8th century to the early 11th century, presents a fascinating and often misunderstood chapter of history. The Norsemen, known for their seafaring exploits, their raids, and their rich cultural traditions, lived by a code that may seem shocking to modern sensibilities. Yet these practices were deeply rooted in their societal norms and values. Let us explore some of the most striking elements of Viking culture practices that were once considered normal in their time. Raids were a rite of passage in Viking society. Raids were not merely acts of violence or plunder, they were a vital part of a young man's transition to adulthood, known as Vikinger. These raiders would embark on expeditions across seas, targeting coastal towns and monasteries for wealth and glory. For many young men, participating in a raid was an essential step in proving their bravery and earning respect. The Viking historian Snorri Sturluson in his Heimskringla notes that kings and chieftains would often send their sons on raids to develop leadership skills and foster connections with other powerful figures. The raids were deeply intertwined with their belief in honor and personal glory to return from a raid victorious was to cement one's status in Viking society. The wealth, reputation, and respect gained from successful raids could elevate a man to the highest echelons of society. For many young Viking men, taking part in raids was a rite of passage. It marked the transition from childhood to adulthood. It allowed young men to prove their strength and bravery as well as gain the respect of their peers and elders. Raids were seen as opportunities for both personal and communal glory for these warriors. Participating in them was an essential step to securing their place in Viking society. The dark fate of captured THS. Slavery was an integral part of Viking society, and those captured during raids often became THS, or slaves bound to their captors. THS were treated as property, not people, and their fates were grim. While some THS were integrated into households as servants, others faced harsher conditions, particularly those captured from rival tribes or distant lands. Female THS in particular were vulnerable to severe mistreatment by their masters, including forced labor and exploitation. They had no rights and were treated as property. The Viking sagas describe the brutal reality for many of these captives. Some were sacrificed to the gods during rituals, others worked as laborers on farms, and some were even traded across the Norse world as Viking explorer and trader. Ibn Fadlan observed the Viking slave trade was a thriving enterprise, with captured individuals often sold in exchange for weapons, food, or riches. The fate of the THS was determined by their captors, and survival was often a matter of luck. While some captives were incorporated into the households of their captors and treated as laborers, others faced a more brutal existence. Tissu, who were captured in raids, had no rights and were treated as mere property. They were subjected to forced labor and exploitation. Many faced harsh conditions that often led to suffering or death. Their fate was entirely at the mercy of their captors, who could dispose of them as they saw fit. Viking women in battle. While Viking society is often depicted as male-dominated, Viking women were far more integral to the culture than many realize, and some even participated in battle known as shield maidens. These women were warriors who fought alongside men, defending their lands and engaging in raids. Though the historical evidence for shield maidens is limited and often mixed with legend, there are several accounts in the sagas and historical texts that suggest some Viking women did indeed take up arms. The saga of the Valkyries speaks of women who chose those fated to die in battle and guided them to Valhalla, but it also hints at real women who fought in combat, not just in myth. In particular, the famous warrior Lagertha, mentioned in Saxo Grammaticus Gesta Danorum, is depicted as a fierce shield maiden who led troops and fought bravely. Other accounts, such as those by Ibn Fadlan during his travels, also suggest that Viking women, particularly from high-status families, were not afraid to wield weapons when necessary. In Viking culture, women had a more prominent role than often assumed. They were integral to Viking society both at home and on the battlefield. While the notion of shield maidens has been romanticized and clouded by legend, there is historical evidence suggesting that some Viking women did indeed participate in battle. They fought beside the men and defended their homes and families from invaders and threats. These warrior women are often portrayed as having been fierce leaders, commanding troops and engaging in combat with the same courage and ferocity as their male counterparts. They used urine to start fires. While it may sound bizarre today, the Vikings had a practical reason for using urine in their daily lives, particularly when it came to starting fires. Urine, when combined with certain materials, created a substance that could ignite easily. Viking warriors often carried small kits that contained flint and steel, but urine-soaked cloths were sometimes used as fire-starting tools in emergencies. This practice was not unique to the Vikings. Other ancient cultures, including the Romans, also used urine for medicinal and utilitarian purposes. The Vikings, however, took advantage of the environment around them, making use of all available resources in their harsh northern climates. This method of fire starting may seem odd, but it illustrates the Vikings' ingenuity and resourcefulness. The use of urine as a fire-starting tool might seem strange today, but for the Vikings, it was an essential survival method in their harsh northern environment when mixed with certain materials. Urine could be used to start fires even in wet conditions. The Vikings were known for their resourcefulness and their ability to use the environment around them to their advantage. This practice is just one example of how they made use of every available resource to survive and thrive in their challenging world. Children became adults at age 12 in Viking society. In Viking society, childhood was a brief stage of life. Children were expected to take on adult responsibilities at a young age, with many reaching adulthood by the time they were 12. This age marked the transition to a life of full participation in the community, where they could marry, fight, or engage in other adult roles. The Viking sagas reflect this early transition into adulthood, with young warriors being praised for their achievements at a surprisingly early age. A passage from the Saga of the Inklings tells of a boy who led his first raid at the age of 12. This quick maturation was a necessity in a culture constantly at war, where survival depended on strength, courage, and practical knowledge. These early adulthood rites were tied to a Viking belief in the necessity of preparing for a life of struggle and honor. The Viking culture placed a strong emphasis on early maturation due to the harsh realities of their environment and the constant need for warriors. The Vikings valued strength, bravery, and the ability to provide for and defend one's family and village. Young Viking children were raised to embrace these values and were expected to take on adult responsibilities as soon as they could physically and mentally handle them. It was not unusual for young boys to take part in raids or battle at a young age, marking their passage into adulthood with such significant actions. Revenge killings were legal. Revenge killings or blood feuds were not only common in Viking society, but they were also sanctioned by law. The concept of honor was deeply embedded in Viking culture, and the idea of avenging a wrong against oneself or one's family was seen as an essential duty. If a member of a family was killed or wronged, the victim's kin had the legal right to take vengeance, sometimes even in the form of killing the perpetrator or their relatives. The Gragas, the legal code of Iceland, explicitly acknowledges the practice of revenge killings, outlining when and how such acts could be legally carried out. This concept was so deeply ingrained in Viking society that even the leaders and chieftains were expected to uphold these codes of revenge. Failure to seek justice for a killing could lead to a loss of honor and respect. The practice of blood feuds or revenge killings was so integral to Viking society that it was enshrined in law. Families who were wronged had the right to avenge their loved ones through whatever means necessary, often leading to a cycle of violence that could last generations. The Viking sagas and historical texts recount countless instances of vengeance being carried out on behalf of murdered family members. Some of these acts of revenge were seen as acts of honor and were publicly celebrated as necessary for preserving family honor and societal integrity. Polygamy was common among Viking leaders. Polygamy, the practice of having multiple wives, was common among Viking leaders and chieftains. While it was not the standard practice for all Vikings, wealthy and powerful men often took multiple wives or concubines as a way to solidify political alliances and ensure the continuation of their lineage. This practice was especially common among kings and high-ranking warriors. The saga of Harald Fairhair recounts how Harald, the first king of Norway, took numerous wives, a strategy that allowed him to maintain control over a vast network of lands and alliances. Marrying multiple women was also seen as a means of securing heirs to inherit one's fortune and status. While polygamy was largely confined to the upper echelons of Viking society, it was an accepted practice and a tool for maintaining power and influence. Kings and powerful warriors used it to forge political alliances and to ensure their family lines continued through multiple heirs. Though not all Vikings practiced polygamy, it was common for those in positions of power to marry several women as a means of strengthening their rule and securing their dynasty. Viking women's role in society. The Viking world was far from the romanticized image of warriors and raids. It was a complex and harsh society, driven by survival power and the pursuit of influence. From the brutal fate of fist to the practice of polygamy as a political strategy, the Vikings were far more than just raiders. Their culture was shaped by necessity and strategy, where every action, whether in battle or in the home, had a purpose. Viking women, though often depicted in traditional roles of wives and mothers, played an important part in Viking society as well. They were responsible for managing households, overseeing the care of children and animals, and ensuring the welfare of the family when their husbands were away on raids or expeditions. Viking women were expected to take on these responsibilities with strength and authority. Some Viking women were also known to fight alongside men in battle and were known as shield maidens. Though the historical evidence for shield maidens is limited and often mixed with legend, there are accounts in the sagas and other historical texts that suggest some Viking women did indeed take up arms and fight in battle. These women were revered for their bravery and strength and were considered an essential part of Viking warfare, defending their families and homes from invaders. Vikings and the concept of honor. The concept of honor was deeply embedded in Viking culture. It governed not only how individuals interacted with one another, but also how they viewed themselves and their place in the world. A Viking's honor was linked to their bravery in battle, their ability to protect their family and community, and their loyalty to their comrades. Those who failed to live up to these expectations were often seen as weak or dishonorable and were subject to public scorn and shame. The Viking sagas are filled with stories of individuals who fought for their honor and the honor of their family and friends and were willing to go to great lengths to defend it, including engaging in blood feuds, revenge killings, or even sacrificing their own lives. Honor was not only about individual actions but also about the collective reputation of one's family and tribe. Viking culture placed immense value on loyalty and respect for one's kin, and to dishonor one's family was considered one of the greatest transgressions a Viking could commit. The concept of honor served as a guiding force throughout Viking society, shaping their laws, customs, and daily lives.